Hello and welcome to A Deeper Dive with me, Dara Cam. Today I am really excited to have the First Lady of Government in the Sunshine of Florida with us for the podcast, Barbara Petersen, who has been fighting for public records for decades and now is the Executive Director of the Florida Center for Government Accountability. We will be talking about open records and public records, how they led to the uncovering of allegations of rape against the Republican Party of Florida Chairman Christian Ziegler. We'll be talking about Marsy's Law, and we will be talking about migrant flights and much, much more.
It would send a very clear message to the legislature that you do not mess around with our constitutional right of access. Pay attention, take it seriously, and follow the Constitution. That's all we're asking.
You're listening to A Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida.
I am so excited, you can hear it in my voice, to have sitting in the terracotta room with me today my old pal Barbara Petersen. We had a discussion with my friend when I was talking about the introduction for Barbara. I wanted to call her the doyenne of government in the sunshine in Florida, and my friend said, no, she's the queen of government in the sunshine in Florida. Welcome to the podcast, Barbara.
Well, thank you so much, Dara. It's really good to be here. It really is.
Barbara, you have been fighting for public records for an open government for more than 2 decades.
I worked for the legislature for 4 years doing open government work, and then in 1995 went to work for the First Amendment Foundation. So I was there for 25 years.
And then you started the Florida Center for Government Accountability, which is getting international attention right now. Why don't you tell us why?
We were hearing rumors of a possible sexual assault by Christian Ziegler, who is the head of the Florida Republican Party. And I think a lot of people were hearing those rumors, but we went and started making public records requests. Our lead investigator, Michael Barfield, made requests of the Sarasota Police Department, Sarasota County Sheriff, and the Sarasota County Clerk of Court. And we started making public records requests. And the first record we received was a copy of the incident report, which was almost totally redacted. Mm-hmm. There were only 5 words that were unredacted. Redacted also was Christian Ziegler's name, which is very unusual and probably not authorized under the law. We're pushing back on that. But we knew it was Christian Ziegler because we requested all records relating to Christian Ziegler. So we knew it was him.
Wow.
And the incident report confirmed the rumors, so we reported that, and then we were able to obtain the 911 tape. A friend of the victims, a coworker, called 911 asking for a wellness check, and the Sarasota County Sheriff does emergency responses, so that record we got from the sheriff. And then we got the affidavit and the search warrants from the clerk of court. So we've been reporting these, as they come out. But we have a different, maybe unique model in that we do investigative reporting, but we also share all of the documents that we receive through our public records requests. So we made all of those records available to anyone who asked for them.
And this is a new kind of endeavor for you. The First Amendment Foundation was very helpful in suing or helping reporters to make sure that their public records requests were fulfilled.
Right.
You're doing some of the litigation still at the center.
The First Amendment Foundation never litigated on its own. When I was at the foundation, it was common to join other media outlets in a consortium, but the First Amendment Foundation never brought its own lawsuits. At the Florida Center, we are litigating because we found that it's very difficult under this administration to get records that we have a constitutional right to obtain. And there are long delays, I think, as everybody knows, sometimes 14, 15, 16 months of delays. And so we have started, we launched FLCGA in April of 2021, and we filed our first lawsuit in August of 2021. Since that first lawsuit, we've filed 7 more lawsuits. One was over access to the migrant flight records, the Martha Vineyard flight records. Yes. We got those records, and we worked with, most recently, 60 Minutes. Did a big segment on the migrant flights, and they used our records, the records we obtained, as the basis for their reporting. We got a big shout out on 60 Minutes, wow, which was great. And then,
whoops, wrong one.
That's funny.
Yeah.
The judge in that case ordered the release of the records, and Governor DeSantis and his team have appealed that decision, which I don't know why, since we have the records.
This was the one where I'm trying to remember her name.
Perla
was they were emailing, and they were using what was the disappearing
not WhatsApp. Yes, they were using a
text messaging platform where
things would disappear.
Right.
They were using aliases.
Oh, Clarice Starling. That was Starling. The head, the public safety czar. Larry Keefe was
Clarice Starling. He also had I think it was Hammer 19. It was, when I'm reading all of this, in the emails, I kept thinking about a TV show when I was a kid. The guy was a spy, and he kept taking off his shoe. It was a comedy, Get Smart.
Get Smart.
Yes, that's what I kept thinking of.
Right.
Clarice Starling, seriously?
Right.
These are people's lives.
Yeah.
You are upending people's lives.
These are people who were seeking asylum.
People who needed help, not ridicule, not derision, and certainly not this silliness. If it wasn't so serious, it would be like a clown show. It would be like Get Smart, but it is so serious what's happening. And so we've filed a couple of lawsuits. We filed a lawsuit against Vertol, the company, the contractor that arranged the flights, and the Department of Transportation. That case was before Judge Angela Dempsey.
Yes.
And she ruled against us.
She's also got the Washington Post case, which we'll talk about in a moment,
yes,
I'm sure. But she ruled against you in the Vertol case.
She ruled against us in the Vertol case. We've appealed, and there was an issue as to whether emails sent and received by government officials and those working on behalf of government, so emails that directly relate to public business, whether those emails are public record under Florida's public records law. That was an issue.
The governor and his lawyers are arguing that they are exempt because of executive privilege.
They lost the executive privilege. They made that argument in our case against the governor and the EOG.
Okay.
I don't even think that came up in the case against Vertol and DOT.
Sorry.
It might have, but I don't think we got there because she said the emails weren't public record. So we've appealed that case. We have a couple of others. We have 2 against New College. But the executive privilege case, that was not our case. It was a John Doe plaintiff. John Doe had made a public records request. and I don't know who John Doe is, but John Doe had made a public records request of the governor's office. Governor DeSantis, was on some radio show and said that he had a group of advisors who were advising him on judicial appointments. And John Doe made a public records request for that list. And that request was denied, and so he sued. I mean, this is the unfortunate part of our public records law in Florida. The only way to enforce the law on the citizens' side is to litigate. I mean, we don't want to sue, but if that's the only way we can get our records, we're going to sue. So John Doe filed a lawsuit, and the governor's attorneys argued that the governor did not have to release those records because he had executive privilege. There is no executive privilege in Florida law. There is a limited executive privilege at the federal level, but it all relates to national security. And so Judge Dempsey agreed with the governor's assertion of executive privilege and ruled against John Doe. That case is also on appeal, and it's very frightening because if the appellate court, should the governor prevail, he can decide what records will be released, what records won't be released, who we can depose in his administration. With executive privilege, it would be the death knell of open government and government accountability in Florida.
And I mean, I think it's important in case some of our very sophisticated listeners might not be aware of this, that we have a very broad constitutional guarantee of open records. Maybe we can start, you can tell us a little bit about that, then I want to get back to some of the litigation.
The constitutional right of access is under Article 1, Section 24. It became effective, it was on the ballot in the 1992 general election, and at the time it had the highest voter approval rating in Florida. It was, I think, 87% of voters approved that constitutional right of access. And there's two provisions. One relates to records, one relates to meetings. But under the records provision, which is paragraph A, we have a right of access to the records of all three branches of state government. That's unique. Very few states, there are about a half a dozen states that have constitutional rights of access, but they're much more vague than Florida. But what's most important, in addition to those constitutional rights of access to records and meetings, there is a standard in the Constitution for the creation of exemptions to that right of access. And that standard says that only the legislature can create exemptions to our right of access.
They do that hard.
They do that regularly and repeatedly.
Yeah.
I think we have 1,200 exemptions now. So only the legislature can create the right of access. That means that Governor DeSantis can't decide that he's not going to give us these records unless he has specific statutory authority. And Judge Dempsey can't find executive privilege. Only the legislature can create an exemption, and there is no executive privilege exemption under the law.
So stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Let's talk a little bit about the role that you all are filling in litigating over some of these records. The Washington Post is in litigation. I'm looking here in my notes to see what their...
It's the travel records exemption.
It is the travel records exemption. I don't know if you saw, but I wrote a story about an attorney who was passed over for a raise and a promotion.
And others who were fired.
For objecting to the governor's office's assertions about what was a public record and what was not.
It was an astounding story, and a Washington Post reporter called me about that. yesterday, and
About my store?
about your story, and wanted to know if this had happened before. And I said, not to my knowledge. I mean, if anything, the reverse. A government employee who failed to provide access might be censured,
Right.
but not an employee who is arguing for access. And in this particular case, worked on the actual language that was adopted and approved.
Of the statute that carved out an exemption for the governor's travel.
It's an amazing exemption, probably the broadest and the most damaging I've seen. Before I started at FAF, I worked for the legislature, so I've been doing this since 1991, and it's all I do. I am really the proverbial one-trick pony. And it exempts not only the governor's travel records, both past and future.
Right, retroactive.
It applied retroactively. It also exempts information about who is visiting him at the mansion and who is visiting him at the office, the governor's office, and then all of these cabinet members and justices and the stated purpose or necessity for that exemption. The constitutional provision says that all proposed exemptions must have a statement of public necessity. So the public necessity statement said that this exemption was necessary to protect the governor's security. And I could see that moving forward, like maybe we shouldn't have access to the governor's travel records when he goes back to Iowa, or he's probably already back there. But why
Retroactively.
Why retroactive? Why can't we get records of his last trip overseas to Israel and Korea and Japan? How does that impact the governor's safety? So the bill had a faulty justification. And I also heard, and I can't remember if I heard this or read it, but that FDLE was saying they needed the exemption because they were getting too many public records requests.
Is that
that's great. Let's just, I'm sure the property appraiser would say the same thing, or the supervisor of elections. That's not a justification.
Yeah.
What they did, if they have too many public records requests, then hire more staff to process those public records requests. And right now, FDLE is the biggest bottleneck.
Well, they might have a lot of public records requests because the governor is running for president and he's
they've
traveling all over the country, and he's doing a lot more travel than a lot of
But remember, this was last year. Well, it was not last year. It was last session.
Okay, but ostensibly, he was laying the groundwork.
Right, he was
doing a lot of travel around the country.
Right. But this protects not just his travel, Rick Scott's travel when he was governor, Charlie Crist's travel, Lawton Childs' travel, and how long has he been dead?
I gotcha.
So
what's the security?
What's the security interest there?
Right.
And I worked with the First Amendment Foundation and helped them draft an amendment to the bill that, in my opinion, would have served the purpose of protecting the security of the governor without being overly broad. So if it's past travel, you have access. If it's current or future travel, you have to wait until the travel has occurred.
Right.
But they wouldn't listen. That was a done deal. It was, as we used to say, greased. Nothing and no one was going to stop that bill.
And so is that law being challenged?
The Washington Post, and I've heard this from a number of reporters, not just in Florida, but all over the country, because everybody's now very interested, obviously, in what Governor DeSantis is doing and where he's going. But I've heard from reporters who have told me that their requests with FDLE for the travel records, some of them are 14, 16, 18 months old. And they're not getting their records, but they're also not getting a denial of their records.
Right. They
And
just
so
go into
They just
purgatory.
in purgatory.
Yeah.
And the Washington Post had made one of those requests before the exemption passed. They didn't get the records. And they got no denial citing that new travel records exemption.
They're supposed to give you a
They
citation.
have
for
to give
the
you a
exemption.
citation. And so they filed a lawsuit over the unreasonable delay, and that went before Judge Angela Dempsey, and she agreed with the Washington Post and ordered FDLE to produce the records. And FDLE provided some of the records, some records that the Post had requested, but none of the travel records. And for the first time, we have FDLE claiming the protection of that exemption. And so now Washington Post is challenging that exemption. And it's a very important case for all sorts of reasons. I mean, not just because we need to know, and we do need to know, we have a right to know, but also it would send a very clear message to the legislature that you do not mess around with our constitutional right of access. Pay attention, take it seriously, and follow the Constitution. That's all we're asking, is that they comply with the constitutional standard.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be right back with Barbara Petersen, Executive Director of the Florida Center for Government Accountability.
Here at Deeper Dive, we want to hear from you, the listeners. We invite you to send your questions, comments, and feedback to our mailbag. You can reach us at deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. That's deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. Get your 2 cents in by sending us an email.
Welcome back to A Deeper Dive with Dara. It's interesting because what you all are doing involved in litigation is the kind of thing that the Washington Post is doing, and that newspapers didn't used to have to do as much as they do now, but newspapers, media outlets had a lot more resources than they do now. And there was a lot more investigative journalism taking place in Florida in particular than there is now. And I'm wondering if one of the reasons that if that affected what you decided to do when you launched the Florida Center for Government Accountability.
So as I said earlier, we are unique. I mean, not just because we share and assist. So we have 2 programs. We have our investigative journalism. We publish the Florida Trident.
That's the outlet
that's our news
that
outlet.
released all of the stories that broke the news about the RPOF chairman and his wife,
That's
the
correct.
co-founder of Bridget Ziegler. We haven't mentioned yet that part of the reasons why this is so salacious and has drawn international news is because your reporting revealed that, based on the public records that you obtained, revealed that that Mr. Ziegler and his wife, Bridget Ziegler, one of the co-founders of Moms for Liberty, who serves on the Sarasota County School Board, were involved in a consensual 3-way relationship with the woman who is the alleged victim in the alleged rape.
That's correct. That was a statement by Mrs. Ziegler that was in the affidavit that supported the warrants.
It was a bombshell.
It was a bombshell. So we have our investigative reporting.
Yes, I'm sorry.
It's the Florida Trident. And then we also have a public access program where we hear a rumor. Michael Barfield is our lead investigator. Bob Norman is our news editor of the Trident. And we hear the rumor, Michael makes the public records request. After the Martha's Vineyard flights, the migrant flights, there were all these questions: how much did it cost, who was paying for it, why there, what. So we started making public records requests there. And in that particular case, the EOG was dragging its feet, and there's a provision in the law, there's a 30-day rule about, retaining records. And so day 31, we wanted to make sure those records were retained and not destroyed. So we filed a lawsuit. And as I said, we've filed now. We have one against Manatee County, but all the others have to do with the DeSantis administration. And we also, so we do that, we file those lawsuits, and that, I mean, you're talking about the news outlets not having the resources. They have far more resources than we have. We have a staff of 3,
Right.
including me.
Right.
We have a budget of about $250,000 a year. But it was one of the incentives. So when I was thinking about this, I was talking to other people about this idea of mine. When I worked at the First Amendment Foundation, I talked to a lot of citizens all over the state of Florida who couldn't get their records, who are having these problems with government. And I would call, if it's in Pinellas County, I'd
Right,
call
the
whoever I knew
clerk
at
of
the
the court,
Times.
right.
And
You would
I'd
call the
media.
reporter,
I
right.
would call the reporter. I've got the best story for you.
Right.
And nobody had the time.
Yeah.
And this is a frustration with citizens. People don't listen to them. I had a call from a guy yesterday. He said, I have called this X newspaper 10 times, and they just blow me off. And you're the first person who took my call.
Mm-hmm.
So we listen to citizens. And in fact, I would say 80%, if not 90% of our investigative reporting is based on tips from citizens. And so that was, we need somebody to report what's happening. All of our stories are local. We haven't yet delved into the, state government. We plan to, but at this point, they're all locally based, but they're in communities all over Florida.
Well, the Christian Ziegler story is
Sarasota story.
Okay.
It's a local story that's taken national, now international.
Well, he is the state chairman of the state,
but he lives
Republican.
in Sarasota, and
Yes.
all of the records were.
I got you.
Yeah. So that's
So
what
you're doing these at local, and I saw something that you had also this week. I should remind our listeners that we are recording this. As of the time we are recording this, Christian Ziegler is still the chair of the party of the RPOF, and
no charges have been filed.
No charges have been filed,
Yeah.
and we are recording this a couple days before it will be released. So let's just keep that in mind. But what I was saying was that so you were making local records requests.
We get tips from citizens. For example, we published a series of stories last year about the executive director of a small special district in North Broward, where the director was giving himself, I think it was $16 million in no-bid contracts.
Oh, yeah.
That came as a tip from somebody who lived in that special district.
Yeah, the story that I was talking about that I distracted myself from was about the property appraiser in Collier County, which was really interesting. And if you haven't read it, you need to go to the Florida Center for Government Accountability's website, which is...
it's flcga.org, and then you click on Trident News.
Yeah. So you need to read the Collier County.
It's funny because that story, we've had as much response to that story as we have had to the Ziegler story, with people emailing us.
It's people being hit in their pocketbooks. I had just gotten a call 2 days ago, 2 days before your story came out, from a reader / listener in St. Johns County, complaining of a very similar thing. So it was like, I thought, the timing of it made me
Yeah.
laugh to myself, although it's not funny. It's
No, it's not. I
Yeah.
mean, the value of these people's homes is doubling
Right.
and tripling in the space. So that means that their property taxes are doubling and tripling in the space of just a couple of years.
yeah.
So, as I said, we work off local.
Sure.
They're tips, mostly from tips, and we have a group where this is a pilot project right now, but we have a group of citizen activists in Southwest Florida, Lee and Collier County, and they're called the Citizens for Government Accountability, Southwest Florida, and they work with us. They bring us tips because it's, if you think about it, reporters, when there were large newsrooms, you had the local education reporter, you had the college higher education reporter, you had the city hall reporter. Now
We're in the Wayback Machine.
oh yeah, the Wayback Machine. It's the citizens who are going to the school board meeting, to the city commission meeting, to the county commission meeting, and they're hearing things and seeing things, and they're bringing that to us. And so the idea of this pilot project is that we will work with them to try to get their issues covered. They help us if we need to pick up records from the Lee County Clerk of Court. They'll run over to the clerk's house or the clerk's office and get the records or pay the fee.
We hope they're not at the clerk's house.
Well, that's happened. But the idea is to get those citizens involved because citizen engagement is critically important to a healthy democratic society.
So I love when this happens, Barbara, when our conversation organically flows and my questions that I was going to ask that I have on my computer screen, you start answering. And one of my questions was going to be like, why does Joe Lunchbucket care about what we're talking about today? Why does Jane Lunchbucket care about what your center is doing and access to public records and open government?
I think, our main mission, we have the public access side of us and we have the investigative reporting side of us. Our mission is government accountability. And there's a strong distrust of government these days among most people. And providing them with information is important. Information in their own communities is important, one, to help them understand what's happening, but also important in sort of rebuilding that trust. Hiding things, the Pete Antonacci, laid in the floor for 25 minutes. Why did it take 8 months to get that information in a dogged pursuit of public records from the Bulldog?
Yeah.
Why?
Good shout out to Dan for that.
Yeah, it was a great story and a very sad story that a man of that stature was allowed to lay in a hallway in the governor's office?
Right outside the governor's office, yeah.
For 25 minutes. And it took him 8 months. Now, it could be a very good explanation, but doesn't that raise suspicions? Yes. Doesn't suspicion, breed distrust? Yes. And so government accountability and government transparency are critically important. And when you talk about Joe and Jane, I've been so encouraged in the last week with all of the $5, $10, and $20 donations we're receiving. That means as much to me as a $50,000 or $100,000 donation. These people who appreciate what we're doing, understand that what we're doing is so important that they'll take their $5 or their $10 and send it to us. And that, to me, it's just, it really is heartwarming and very, very encouraging.
And you were telling me earlier, you've been on MSNBC, we're on the Joy Reid Show, you're on BBC, you're making international news. I think one of the things that is important, not only to be government watchdogs and to rebuild trust with the public and government, is just making government work. I mean, sometimes government doesn't work for the
Right.
citizens. And, when your property taxes are doubled and the guy next door's or the hotel next door's aren't, then, I mean, somehow you need to call attention to things so that government functions in the way that it's supposed to function, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. And what I hear all the time, I hear it now, I heard it for the 25 years I was at the First Amendment Foundation, is citizens upset and distraught by what they see as a disrespect from their government, from their elected representatives. When this is what just infuriates me when I now listen to a legislative committee and people. Tallahassee is not easy to get to.
Really hard.
It's really hard to get
Yeah,
here. And these people take the day off work or 2 days off work
to schlep
and
up here.
to come up here, and they get in front of that committee and are told that they have 30 seconds. And I heard from a disabled, the mother of a disabled child. There was a couple of bills, and she said, she brought her son up here to testify. He's got maybe a minute or 30 seconds. And she said, and I'm looking up, and none of the legislators are paying any attention to him. They're whispering to each other. They're on their devices. They're not paying attention to him. And I think too often, and there are exceptions and really good exceptions to this rule, but too frequently, those who are elected to office to represent us forget that they are public servants. They are there to represent our interests, and how do they know what our interests are if they won't listen to us, if they won't allow us to speak? And, it is the ultimate sign of disrespect to not listen to someone who's speaking to you.
Barbara used to have a spreadsheet she would send around with bad bills and good bills, with the bright red, highlighted in bright red, the bill numbers that were bad bills, and bright green for the very few that were past Barbara's muster. I wanted to talk a little bit. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about a recent. We talk about the remedy first is to go to the courts. The first, the governor has reshaped the judicial system, really. I have said, and there have been other people on the podcast who've said, the governor really controls 3 branches of government.
Right.
It's the first time that I think any governor has.
And there's Florida's a reason there are 3. But go ahead.
I was watching Schoolhouse Rock the other day, and it reminded me. I saw it on Twitter. That there was a recent Florida Supreme Court decision, unanimous decision. Now there are 5 justices of 7 that were appointed by Governor DeSantis. They're all, I believe, members of the Federalist Society. There was a constitutional amendment voters approved a couple of years ago called Marsy's Law. It creates a variety of rights for victims. The Tallahassee Police Department used that constitution. 2 police officers used that amendment to try to protect the identities of 2 officers who were involved in deadly use of force incidents, saying that they were victims. So the Supreme Court recently, the city of Tallahassee disagreed with the its own police department's interpretation.
Police union.
Right, I'm sorry, that's right. It was
union.
the Florida Police Benevolent Association. Yes, I have written about this many times. Thank you. The city of Tallahassee disagreed with the union's interpretation and went all the way to the Supreme Court. I think many of us observers were surprised that the court found unanimously that the amendment does not shield the identities not only of law enforcement officers, but of anyone.
Right. Any victim.
Any victim.
Any victim. It was a surprising decision. I wasn't terribly surprised at the decision. I was surprised it was unanimous. And I was also very surprised at the strength of the opinion. And basically what the court said was that Marsy's Law does not protect the identity of the victim. That there is still that right of a criminal to defendant to be,
confront
the accuser. And what warms my heart, Article 1, Section 24, our constitutional right of access. And that says, as I said, only the legislature can create exemptions, but we can put exemptions in the Constitution.
Right.
But Marsy's Law is not an exemption.
Yeah, it protects, I think the language of it says that it protects any information that could
Be used to
locate
or harass the victim. And it doesn't say this information is exempt. It says that it gives the victim of a crime the right to request that information be withheld. And what's happened since Marsy's Law took effect, we have highway department, whoever does traffic.
Highway safety and motor vehicles.
Do they deal with the traffic, with the accidents, or is that Department of Transportation? Anyway, the agency responsible.
I think it's DHSMV.
Yeah.
Those are the state troopers.
They are withholding the names of people involved in car crashes. A car crash, you rear-end me because you're not paying attention. I'm not a victim. I was in an accident. You haven't victimized me. So we don't know what victim means under Marsy's Law. We don't know what crime means. I always use the example, I'm visiting my friend in Winter Park and somebody burglarizes or vandalizes my car. I'm a victim of a crime, but why are you protecting my name? I don't even live in Winter Park. I live in Tallahassee. I'm just visiting.
It's problematic. It was being interpreted differently all over the state. But now, the Supreme Court did note in that opinion that the legislature could create an exemption if they want to. And we hear lawmakers now are saying, that this needs to be fixed.
It needs to be fixed. It needs to be fixed. And of course, we don't trust the legislature because they just, an exemption.
Right.
When Marsy's Law took effect, the first session, I actually was at the First Amendment Foundation. Yes. I drafted implementing legislation. And we sat down and we counted all of the victim exemptions in current law. Like, the alleged victim in the rape, brought the rape charges against Mr. Ziegler. Identity of victims of sexual assault are exempt and have been exempt long before Marsy's Law took effect. And so there are a number of exemptions.
Child victims, I think.
Child victims, all sorts of there's an exemption in 119 that says if you've been a victim of a crime and where you live could increase your risk, if you're the victim of a stalker or domestic violence, then where you live will be exempt everywhere, in every record, if you request it in writing and you provide proof that the crime occurred. So there are plenty of protections in law. Marsy's Law was not needed. And as we've seen, it's caused a lot of problems. If I'm moving into a new community, the first thing I want to do, because I'm frequently alone, I want to check crime statistics. And in some cases, law enforcement is redacting the location of the crime, even if the victim doesn't live there.
Right.
It's like my example in Winter Park. I'm visiting. If they're going to exempt the location of the crime, but I live in Tallahassee.
Yeah. It makes no sense.
None of it has made any sense. And so yes, we worry about it being, kicking the can back to the legislature. But if the legislature does what the legislature should be doing and pays attention to that opinion, which highlighted the importance of our right of access and that constitutional standard, then we might be certainly better off. But the idea that we would allow anonymity for a law enforcement
Yes.
officer who is involved in a lethal use of force, and neither of those officers were hurt.
Right.
You know, of course, a law enforcement officer, while on duty, is going to be involved in criminal activities.
It's part of their job.
It's
is
their
what,
job.
yeah,
They're
right.
wearing, personal protection gear. They've got weapons. They've got tasers. And so how can they be a victim?
Right.
And what does that do if we can't know the officer involved in this lethal use of force? We can't ascertain whether this is the first time, the 10th time, the 100th time.
Exactly.
It's unbelievable.
So
to
we
me.
hope that the legislature isn't going to create an exemption for law enforcement officers.
Exactly. We hope. We hope. And that's why it's so important to pay attention. Most people I think people are most affected by what happens in their local communities, the school board, the city council. But the legislature passes these laws, and they don't always listen to us, the people those laws affect. They rarely listen to us. But in this case, I think there should be, once we see the legislation, and then we have to pay attention to it because they amend it throughout the process. But there has to be a lot of citizen attention paid to anything that they pass or consider in this regard.
Again, like when the organic flow here, I just and thank you again, and really kudos to you and your team for all the great work that you're doing. I just want to wrap. What's your biggest concern about transparency and government in the sunshine going forward?
I'm deeply worried about the future of open government in Florida. We have always set the national standard. We are the Sunshine State, and it is government in the sunshine. I was talking to a broadcast journalist earlier this week who told me he left Florida in the early 2000s, and we had the best open government laws, and now he's back and he's appalled. And the biggest thing that worries me, I think, is the lack of checks and balances. That because Governor DeSantis has asserted his control over all three branches of government, that the legislature isn't pushing back. The courts, Marcy's Law, I think that's one reason it surprised everybody.
Right.
A friend of mine told me it was truly a nonpartisan decision. And we used to be able to rely on the courts. We might have a recalcitrant records custodian, but when the case went to the court, and maybe not the trial court, but when it went to the appellate court, I don't think that's the case anymore. That there's no one I see in government standing up for the rights of the citizens in this state.
I just want to mention that Justice Curiel wrote that opinion
And
in
it's
the
a
Marcy's
great
Law
opinion.
case.
It's a really, like I said, it's a solid opinion, and he pinned his opinion on two very important rights, constitutional rights: the right of a criminal defendant to face the accuser, and the constitutional right of access of the citizens to get records and attend meetings of their government.
Well, Barbara, thank you so much. It has been such a joy having you in here in person with me, and you promised you're going to come back soon, right?
I'll come back.
Thank you.
We've got more reporting to do.
We are on the edge of our seats.
A Deeper Dive with Dara is hosted by Dara Cam, produced by Ryan Daly, and music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs LLC and performed by Ryan Daly and Danny Reyes.